That's cool. Okay. Well, what I want to do is I've got two presentations here. I'm not going to like go through each one slide by slide. I'm going to kind of bounce around because what I'd like to do is be interactive. So if you guys have specific questions, please feel free to jump right in and ask. A lot of the work that I've been doing lately focuses on shale. So in particular, what's been happening to not only the North American gas market, but the global gas market. Because shale has implications that are farther reaching than just what we see here in the United States. The best way to sort of highlight why that is from a geopolitical perspective is to show you a couple of slides, which is really what I wanted to start with. If you look at this slide, I don't know if we can we dim the front lights? That will actually help make that show up a little better. Well, you're not kidding, people are all into these things. So much for technology. So what you see here is a composite of satellite photographs on clear nights around the world. Actually, these are the ones that I wanted out, not the rest of them. I don't know if that's even possible. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Now you can see that a little better, huh? It's a composite of satellite photographs on clear nights all around the world. So, you've got satellites up there. They're taking pictures constantly. Obviously, there are clouds, but you can just take the clear spots and mesh them together, and this is what you get. It's a classic Earth at Night's photo. You guys have probably seen this, right? National Geographic has a really famous one that they show flares and other things also. But what you see here are the continents, and the little white dots are where we call where the lights are on, right? This is important because we think about where the lights are on as being demand sinks, right? This is where we consume energy. So if you look around the world, you can see the bright spots, right? Eastern half of the United States, Western Europe, Japan, South Korea over there. This is always a fun one to point out because South Korea, if you've got your geography right, maybe I can pull up the arrow, yeah, is right there. It's not an island, although at night it looks like one. You might ask why. Well, that's because access to energy is very much related to politics. Okay? But you can kind of see where we consume energy globally, right? Looking at this picture. There's also some interesting things you can do with time lapse, and there's some research that's going on at Purdue University that's actually doing this, where they look at how the intensity of the lights has changed over time. And the reason they're doing that is they're trying to get a better estimate on the relationship between income growth or GDP growth, growth of the macroeconomy, and energy use. But that's ongoing work, but it's pretty deep. One of the things that you can actually see if you look at the last 20 years using that kind of a methodology is basically the northwest part of India growing brighter and brighter, and the eastern part of China growing brighter and brighter. Right, more so than anywhere else in the world. That's where a lot of the economic growth and increases in energy use have been coming from. The other thing that's superimposed on the picture are blobs of color, right? And this is actually work that was done by the U.S. Geological Survey, so the USGS. What these are regions where there are conventional natural gas resources. Now, conventional gas is different than shale. It is typically in a trap, a petroleum or gas trap that has a nice sort of relatively permeable, relatively porous rock matrix. All the gas molecules are in the pore spaces. You drill into it because of the pressure. Pressure forces migration of the gas to the wellbore, and you get pretty nice production. So you don't really need to do a lot of things to stimulate production in those kinds of traps. Shale is very different because in effect, what you have to do is you have to create the reservoir when you drill the shale because it's low permeability, low porosity, ultra low, right? So if you just drill into the shale, you're really not going to get much production, which is why we end up doing horizontal drilling and then fracturing it. Because what we're doing is creating, in effect, creating pore space, okay? So we get some flow. So if you look at this map, there's no shale on it, okay? This is conventional gas resource. So if we rewind just 10 years from today, as a matter of fact, to the early 2000s, and the slide says 2001, that's just really a reference point. You don't see really any big bright red spots anywhere near North America. Now why do I point out the red spots? Because the point is, the brighter the color, the more intensely endowed the region is with conventional gas resource. And so what you notice is the biggest, brightest red spots in particular on the map are nowhere near where the lights are on, right? So when we think about, well, we're consuming energy where the lights are, but all of the energy resources are far from the lights, then we end up in a situation where we got to figure out how to connect the two. Okay? Unfortunately, this is how politics and geopolitics more generally gets involved in the energy picture. In particular, you've got to cross international borders. Okay? So that means governments at some level are involved with one another in trying to negotiate trade arrangements and development arrangements. Notice where the big bright red spots are here, right? West Siberia, that's up there in Russia, up through the Yamal Peninsula, the Kara Sea. You know, some of the stuff at the top, that's actually Arctic resource. Hasn't been even tapped yet. There's a lot of discussion about it now. You can see the Middle East, very bright, very red. You see West Niger Delta and West Africa more generally. It's sort of red to a sort of bright purple, very well endowed. You get over to the Western Hemisphere, you don't really see a whole lot of red, right? And so this is largely why energy historically, because if I did this for oil, I'd get a very similar kind of map, right? And historically, energy has flowed to the West, right? Now, this wasn't necessarily the case 60 years ago, right? But we're in a very different world 60 years ago, right? Just coming out of World War II 60 years ago, the U.S. was still self-sufficient in terms of oil and gas production. Always been a trade relationship with Canada and Mexico. So generally when people talk about oil and gas markets, they talk about North America, not necessarily just the US. But, you know, we've got a big appetite, right, in the United States. And so we consume a lot of energy, which basically means that we've been dependent on the world for energy resources. I'll just point this out because security, the concept of security is, it really matters where you sit. Right? So if I'm a country, a large energy producer in the Middle East, energy security is actually still important for me because what I want to have is security of demand. It's not security of supply. It's a little bit different, right? So you want to make sure that there are markets that are still willing to purchase your commodity. Security also spills over into food and water. People often talk about the iron triangle. Sometimes it's referred to, but it's the energy, water, food nexus, right? Something a lot of people discuss. And if you were to sort of look at this map and envision, based on where the colors are, the flow of trade over the last 20 or 30 years, you can see that a lot of trade is flowing basically out of this corridor here, east and west, right? If I think about food, I can basically reverse the arrows. Okay, so it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, right? Because you really need arable land, you need water resources, and of course you need energy to produce food. But there's not a whole lot of arable land and easily accessible water resources, particularly in the Middle East, the more arid parts of the world. So security is really a concept that when you think about it, depends on where you sit. Okay, so that's a very important point. And a lot of what I'm going to say is from the standpoint of the United States, or more generally an importing country, okay, energy importing country. Back in the early 2000s, there was a rush to build natural gas import infrastructure, in particular liquefied natural gas import infrastructure, so LNG. This is where we basically take natural gas, we cool it down, negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit, so it becomes a liquid, and basically we put it on a big thermos bottle and ship it across the water. Okay, that's effectively what an LNG tanker is. Now, the technology in shipping has actually evolved quite a bit. It used to be that you had this concept of boil off that you had to deal with because the ambient temperature outside is higher than what you have inside the thermos bottle, and so you'd get some gas that would revaporize and you'd have to do something with it. Some ships would use it as fuel, sometimes it would be vented, but nevertheless you would lose some. There are newer tankers now, in particular they were commissioned by the Qataris, the Q-Max and Q-Flex tankers, which actually recycle the boil off, so there's basically no fuel loss in shipping. That really increased the efficiency of transporting liquefied natural gas around the world, right? So it lowers the cost if you're not losing product. They're also much larger now, so economies of scale play a big role. Well, all of these sorts of things really triggered this rush to begin to think about importing liquefied natural gas in the United States. And so if you look at this map, you understand why, right? You've got a lot of red over there and no red here. So the idea is connect the two up. And so there were, at one point, excuse me, at one point, 47 different terminals that had received certification to import natural gas via LNG in the United States. It's 47. It's a big number, right? And nobody believed they'd all get built. At the end of the day, there were 5 new terminals built. 4 of the existing ones, 3 of them were actually recommissioned and expanded. So there was a lot of capacity added to import natural gas to the United States in the early 2000s through about 2008. Right, so the last one that really came online. Well, what triggered this? Well, there was an increase in price in the United States. And of course, price, when it rises here, if it's not rising elsewhere, signals an opportunity, right? It's an arbitrage opportunity is what we call it. So it's an opportunity to trade from a low-cost region to a high-price region. It's exactly what started to happen. And so investments were made to capitalize on that. At the same time, however, there were some other sort of innovations going on in the upstream sector in the United States in particular that, again, you see a high price. If you're an upstream producer, you might think, well, maybe I'll venture into an area where I know there might not be a high degree of success, but I'm a little more willing to take that chance in a high-price environment. And so this is where you get into a discussion about what George Mitchell did up in the Barnett Shale. Back in the early 2000s, the Barnett Shale sits in the Fort Worth Basin. The entire assessment for that region was about 6 trillion cubic feet of recoverable gas. Okay. We now know that that is way low, okay, almost an order of magnitude low. But Mitchell Energy went up and applied some techniques that had been in development really since the Carter administration. There was a program called the Eastern Gas Shales Project, which was initiated back in the late 1970s. Why was it initiated? Energy security. The idea there was the concern was that we're running out of gas, right, in the United States. And so there was actually legislation back then that banned the construction of any new gas-fired power generation facilities. So it was completely banned. Of course, the economy was growing and we still needed to add power generation capability, so where utilities generally turned was to coal. You saw a massive buildup of coal infrastructure in the late 70s. So, you know, this is another very important point about energy is it's very capital intensive and it's very sticky. So once you build something, you're stuck basically with that for the next 40 to 50 years. So you got to be careful about the decisions you make today because they're going to live with you for a while, right? So in the United States back then we're building up coal, but of course it triggered this, we need to figure out a way to tap these resources that we know are there, we just technologically don't know how to get to them. Okay? So geologists have been writing about shales back in the 1960s, talking about resource in place. So this is, you know, a concept that's much larger than the concept of reserves, right? A lot of analysts, when they talk about energy, will talk about reserves. I'll just tell you right now, if anybody ever talks about reserves and uses reserves in the same context of how long we have until we run out, you should tune them out immediately, okay? Because I'll give you an example. For the better part of 50 or 55 years now, the U.S. has had roughly 11 to 12 years of proven reserves left at current production and consumption levels. Okay? How is that even possible, right? We're talking 55 years that's been true. The point is reserves are really only what's accessible in a very short period of time. There's a very succinct definition that describes what reserves are. Above that is the bubble that we think of as commercially recoverable resource, right? This is resource that we know we could get to using today's technology at current price and cost. It's not necessarily proved and connected, right? But it's something that we know is there. Sometimes when people talk about reserves, they'll say 1P, which is the proved, and 2P, which is proved and probable. That's going to get you into the commercially recoverable sort of set. But then you can extend beyond that and think about what's technically recoverable. So this is what we can get at with today's technology regardless of price and cost, right? So if we even care about price and cost. And then there's the resource in place, which is the big sort of umbrella that everything fits underneath. Why do I mention all this? Well, because back in the 70s, we knew about shale, so this was the big umbrella, right? Just like today, we know about methane hydrates, the big umbrella. It's an issue of what's technically possible, and then ultimately what's commercially possible. Because again, just because something is technically doable doesn't mean it's commercially accessible, right? Because companies aren't going to go out and spend millions of dollars to drill wells into something that's not going to pay out. It's that simple. Okay. So there was a lot of emphasis on trying to figure out how to crack the shale nut, so to speak. Right? And so DOE actually sponsored a program called the Eastern Gas Shales Project, initiated in the late 70s under the Carter administration. Takes a long time for these sort of things to pay off, right? That's one of the biggest lessons you can think of when you think about government-sponsored R&D, right? It can't be a 3 to 4 to 5 year program because that's not where it is. Right now, we're feeling the benefits of something that was initiated back in the late 70s. Okay? Sometimes these things take a while to mature. Now, GRI got involved with DOE, and then ultimately a lot of the advances that they had come up with were taken into the commercial space. And this is where Mitchell Energy went up into the Barnett Shale and actually drilled some wells. Basically, you're drilling vertically up in the Barnett about 3,200 feet. And then horizontally, at that point, they were drilling, I think the max horizon was about 1,000 feet. Okay. Today, we're drilling laterals that are much longer than that. But the idea is you drill down, you drill laterally, that actually makes your wellbore contact a lot more rock, right? And that's really important when you think about ultimately what you want to recover. And then you start actually fracturing the shale and gas starts to flow. And lo and behold, they realize, wow, we can actually do this, right? And we can make money doing this. And then everybody jumped in. The majors were the last to jump in. This is an interesting sort of subset of issues we could talk about in regard to market structure, but it was largely the independents in the United States that fueled this sort of revolution, really. Okay. Well, all of this happened, and that allows us to sort of fast forward to basically current time. Because of what happened in terms of the success of Mitchell and the success of all the predecessors that went into the Barnett, and then ultimately, the Barnett is actually up in, basically sits partially under Fort Worth, so just north of here, west towards the Permian Basin. Okay. There are other shales that are sort of adjacent to it. After the Barnett, we actually realized, well, there's actually shale up in Arkansas that we can go after. That was the next real commercial success, is the Fayetteville. Then after that, there was a lot of interest in the Woodford shales. There's the Arkoma and the Ardmore. Those are both up in Oklahoma, so there was interest in that. Beyond that, there was looking for successes in places like the Marcellus, which sits under Pennsylvania. It's part of the Devonian area shale, which is part of a whole series of shales in the Appalachia region. Okay, so you've heard a lot about that stuff in the news, I'm sure. As a matter of fact, movies that have been made about the pros and cons of doing all this stuff have largely focused on little townships up in that region. Okay? And the Haynesville, which is in northern Louisiana, partially into East Texas, basically sits over the top or fingers through something called the Bossier Shale, which is a different play in East Texas, which is also very successful. And then we get into then we can sort of keep going and start thinking about, well, maybe we can apply this technology to oil. Ultimately, it has been, and you've seen massive successes in the Bakken Shale, which is up in North Dakota. Went from basically nothing in terms of production to over 800,000 barrels a day of production today. Okay, that's a pretty remarkable success, actually. Remarkable turnaround. Eagleford Shale, which is in South Texas, I'm sure you guys have probably heard about that too. It's got different windows, an oil window, a condensate window, and then a gas window. Where the windows come from basically has to do primarily with thermal maturity, so how long the stuff has been cooked, right? But anyway, I've added onto the picture where the shales sit. And the interesting thing about this, you should notice where they are. Okay? In a lot of cases, they're coincidental with where the lights are on. Okay? So that basically means if we can access these in a commercially feasible fashion, it changes the dynamics of international trade in the gas market. it changes the nature at which I think about, well, I need to import gas from northern Russia. It was actually back in the early through the mid-2000s, development up here called the Stockman. It's in the Stockman field, right? They were going to bring it into Murmansk and put it as LNG and ship it down over to Cove Point. There was a long-term contract that had been signed. Well, that blew up, right? Because of shale. We don't need it anymore. The Qataris and ExxonMobil were involved in a big project over here in Qatar to send LNG all the way over to Sabine Pass. It's actually a terminal called Golden Pass. It's on the Texas side of the Sabine Pass River. There's another Sabine Pass terminal which is on the Louisiana side. So there's two terminals basically adjacent to one another across the river. Different ownership, but that capacity is no longer utilized either. Okay, so a lot of this stuff that was built in anticipation of importing a lot of liquefied natural gas is now dead capacity. So it's not used. So of course this means that you can start thinking about shale in the context of energy security, because now we're not relying on importing gas, right? And so therefore we don't really need to worry so much about disruptions in the gas supply chain that originate outside of our sphere of control. Okay. Why do we care about these things? Well, because if you go back to the end of the Second World War, every single recession in the United States, except for one, has been preceded by a run-up in the price of energy. What typically generates these increases? Well, with the exception of what we saw from 2001 through 2008, which was really a demand shock motivated increase, it's because there have been disruptions in supply. Either worker strikes in places like Venezuela and Nigeria, or outright embargoes from the Middle East in terms of shipping oil to the West. All these things created economic turmoil, or what we typically call macroeconomic dislocation. All right? So you get periods of high inflation, high unemployment, low economic growth. None of that's good for anybody, right? So when we think about energy security, typically what we're thinking about is how do we keep all that from happening, right? It's about secure access to supply. But again, that's because of where we sit. We're importers, right? Shale has had massive implications for energy security concerns, right? Not just in the gas sphere, but also in the oil sphere, because you've seen an increase in domestic oil production in the United States year on year since 2008. Right, that's over 4 years running now. Oil production's gone up. That hadn't happened since the late 60s. It's a long time, right? So it is definitely a change in the way we see what's happening in the hydrocarbon space. All right, so why does shale, why does all this, when we think about the United States, why does it have ripple effects? Why does it matter for the rest of the world? Well, I mentioned that there were projects in the pipe to bring natural gas to the Gulf Coast and to the East Coast of the United States via LNG. Well, all of those projects were part of capital investment structures that were vertically integrated. So ExxonMobil, for example, was building a terminal here in Sabine Pass called the Golden Pass Facility. It's a joint venture with QP International, it's Qatar Petroleum. They were also invested in the upstream in terms of field development and liquefaction, so that they could actually contract that supply directly to this terminal. So that's vertically integrated, right? Upstream all the way through to downstream. Well, if all of a sudden you don't need the gas here, but you've already sunk a lot of money over here, right? This project comes online. Now it needs to find a home, because its home when it was originally conceived was going to be the United States. So where do we ship it? That's the question, right? So it goes out here, you can think of it, well, it's not going to sit here and float in the Atlantic, right? It's going to find a place to land. A lot of it was actually landing in Europe. What this did in Europe was it created intense competition in the natural gas space between liquefied natural gas providers and the Russians in particular. Okay. Something else was going on around 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010 that really exacerbated this, right? Massive financial crisis that led to serious economic malaise, right? Really has impacted Europe in a major way. So European demand had been growing for the better part of a decade up until we got to around 2008, right? Demand for natural gas, that is. But there were three countries in particular that were driving that increase in demand. And this is a mouthful, okay? And so you'll understand why if you turn around and say, well, what's the prospect for demand growing going forward, it's very, very small, right? Greece, Italy, and Spain. Those are the three countries that drove with the engine of demand growth in Europe for the better part of the decade leading up to 2008. Now, what do we know has happened in Greece? It's a mess, right, in terms of the economy. What about Spain? It's a mess. What about Italy? It's a mess. Okay, so you get the picture, right? So when you think about this and you think about economic growth, and that's really the engine of growth for demand, right? It's not happening. And so you've got weak demand and you've got new supply. And so what this does is it increases competition for the available market. It also forced utilities to go back to their Russian counterpart, right, Gazprom in particular, and renegotiate contracts. So historically, the way gas has been priced in the international trade arena, so here we're really talking about Europe and Asia, contracts are indexed to oil. So I agreed to deliver some natural gas to you at what we call an oil index price. This is typically 14% of some marker crude, right? So you're sitting here and you're seeing, you know, crude oil prices at $100, and you're saying, all right, if I'm paying 14% of that, that means my gas price is $14. But I see the price over in the U.S. dipping down to $2, right? As recently as last year. I say, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this picture, particularly if all that supply is being turned around. Okay? And so the spot price actually in Europe began to disconnect from the crude index price because capacity was what we call being released. It wasn't needed, right? And so that led to a glut, in effect. Right? There was more supply than was needed. Same thing was actually happening in Asia. I'm sure you guys have all heard about, you know, the Asian price being up around $16 to $18. That's today. That wasn't the case as recently as 3 years ago. Okay? I can talk about that in just a few minutes as well. But so all this new supply that was coming online to try to meet U.S. demand, projected U.S. demand, was turned around. And so it created this increase in supply globally, which in effect raises what we call fungibility, right? Or the ability to move molecules from one point to another. When you have an increase in fungibility, you have an increase in liquidity. When you have an increase in liquidity, that puts pressure on long-term contracts. And so you've seen in Europe already an unwinding of the historical paradigm. Right? A lot of gas is now traded on a spot basis. This wouldn't have happened if all this hadn't occurred in the United States. Right? So it's a it has very important ripple effects. You see shale identified in other parts of the world as well, right? And these are resources that have actually been assessed, but I think except for in 2 cases, there's been no sort of commercial success yet. Okay? And that has a lot to do with above ground factors. Some of it has to do with, you know, the geology and the way the stuff is laid down, how deep it is, how expensive it is to drill the wells, you know, whether or not the shale is clay rich or not. You know, the more clay there is in the shale, when you think about fracturing something, the best analogy I can give you is you think about a brick, right? If the brick has no clay in it, right, it's not that malleable. If I shoot a bullet at it, it's going to shatter. That's exactly what I want to have happen when I hydraulically fracture the shale, because then I create pore space. If there's a lot of clay in it, it just deforms. Right? It's very malleable. And so you don't create a lot of pore space. And so the more clay-rich a shale is, the less success you're going to have fracturing it, typically. And so that means you can go around the world and see some of these actually are very clay-rich shales, and so it's not likely they'll be developed. Okay? But you've seen success in Australia, as a matter of fact, at Beach Energy, and they had some commercial success in the Cooper Basin, in a region called the Napamari Trough. This is a shale that shares a lot of similarities to the Barnett Shale in the United States. And they've already proven commercial success, and then Chevron went in and bought a big chunk of their acreage to sort of jump on the bandwagon, basically, right? Why is that important for Australia? Well, because there's a lot of LNG export capability on the Northwest Shelf and Northern Territory. A lot of that goes up to Asia. They're also developing capability to export on the East Coast to capture coal bed methane and shale. Right? There's already infrastructure in place. The above ground arrangements or the regulatory arrangements between upstream entities that want access to the land and landowners is actually incentive compatible. So what does that mean? Well, with the exception of the United States, if I go anywhere in the world, right, and I want to develop something, I actually have to involve the government. Why? Because the mineral rights belong to the government. They don't belong to the owner of the land. In the United States, that's not the case. Mineral rights typically belong to the owner of the land unless it's on, federal territory, right? And so there's a direct negotiation in those cases between the landowner and the companies. Okay. So what that means is the landowner is actually getting compensated for disturbance to his or her land. If I go elsewhere in the world, there is no compensation, right? So what do you think that means? You think landowners are typically going to be more or less likely to allow access or protest access, I should say. Probably more likely to protest, right? Because they get they get nothing for it. Okay. This is what we mean by incentive compatibility. In Australia, the mineral rights belong to the government, so the landowners don't get anything, right? In terms of mineral rights, in terms of royalties and stuff like that. But companies still have to negotiate for access rights to the land to drill with the landowners. And so by proxy, that allows for some compensation to flow to the landowners. And so you get the right incentive compatibility. In Europe, nowhere is that the case. In China, nowhere is that the case. Argentina, not the case. Right? When we go around the world, it's not the case. And so you end up in a very different kind of regulatory mindset. Argentina, there's a lot of commercial potential with the shales. There's a well-developed gas market, well-developed oil market. There are shales that will be both gas-bearing and oil-bearing. There's already reasonable confidence that these things are going to be very commercially successful. The issue there is the government, right? So I don't know if you guys know this or not, but YPF and Repsol used to actually own most of the production rights in the country. It's largely a private entity. The industry down there was privatized. Well, the government nationalized all the resources and kicked Repsol out. Repsol is actually a Spanish company, right? YPF is still. Right, in terms of how companies react. So you can go around the world and paint all these kinds of different pictures. Not even indicated on here is the likelihood of there being shale in Russia or in the Middle East, and there is. Shale is just a source rock, right? It's where all the stuff is cooked and then migrates up through the reservoir rock, ultimately to be trapped, and that's where we find conventional oil and gas. So there's more of this stuff than what's on the picture. This is just what's been assessed. Right? There's a lot of work in Russia, there's a lot of work in the Middle East to try to assess what's there right now. As a matter of fact, Baker Hughes is involved with Saudi Aramco in the Rub al Khali Basin, which is basically right here, to assess the shale resources there. So it's transformative, right? Now you might ask, well, what does it mean, right? What does it mean for price? And this is a very good question. You can turn the light back on now, actually, if you don't mind, so I can see. It's very transformative. Now, just to show you a little economics, right? Because this is one of the biggest sort of policy questions looming in the U.S. sphere right now regarding natural gas. I know you probably hear a lot in the press about the potential environmental hazards associated with hydraulic fracturing and shale gas production. A lot of that stuff is being studied very carefully right now. As a matter of fact, the Environmental Defense Fund is in the middle of a major study looking at fugitive methane, where they're looking at every piece of the value chain, and they're doing a really good job. As a matter of fact, one of the leads on that work is a rice grad, actually. His name's Bob Harris. I think you know Bob, right? So, they're going to. I've had a conversation with them about presenting that work at the Baker Institute. The first piece of it, which is looking at the gathering and processing piece of the infrastructure, is already in review for publication in a journal. Once that's released, I'm going to ask them to come and present that work because it's very important, right? But the thing that's sort of in in the mind's eye, if you will, of policymakers on Capitol Hill is the idea of exporting liquefied natural gas from the U.S. So remember, just 10 years ago, we were talking about importing, right? So this is a pretty rapid shift. It takes a lot of money to build this infrastructure. Export infrastructure is actually a lot more expensive than import infrastructure. In other words, it's easier to re-vaporize gas than it is to chill it down, okay, in terms of the cost in particular. But there's a lot of interest, largely because, you know, the price here is low relative to the price abroad. Again, that signals an opportunity. And so you have to ask yourself, well, from a policy perspective, and this is where the lenses get sort of funny, because the Department of Energy ultimately has to approve a license for export. And there are two classifications for exporting entities. One is what we call an FTA license. So that's to a country that is what we call a free trade agreement country, FTA. If we have a free trade agreement with a particular country, then the license to export, it's a rubber stamp, right? You get it, do whatever you need to do. But then there's a whole classification of countries called non-FTA countries. So there's countries that don't have free trade agreements with. This is important in the gas space in particular because there's only one country that is a major gas importer globally that we have a free trade agreement with, and that's South Korea.
Where are we at? I know we have North American free trade, so that's Mexico.
Mexico and Canada. We're connected by pipe to them.
Yeah. Oh, and what other kind of generally do we have free trade agreements with? European countries?
Well, only a handful. Let's see. It wouldn't be the UK is not one of them. It's a really weird sort of collection of countries. Let me put it that way. Okay. You'd think we would have one with Japan, for example, but we do not. Okay. So it's a matter of classification, really more than anything else.
So there's not that many free trade agreements?
Not that are gas importers, which is why this matters, right?
Okay.
When you look around the world at all the major countries that can import liquefied natural gas, there's really only one that can import a lot of liquefied natural gas, in South Korea. And so, of course, there's only one LNG export terminal that's under construction right now, and that's the one in Sabine Pass that Cheniere is constructing. Okay? The major buyer of that gas is KOGAS, which is Korean. It's the Korean gas company. Okay? Yes?
Why would South Korea choose to import from the U.S. versus somewhere that's closer to them?
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
Has a lot to do with the nature of price and liquidity, which I'll talk about in just a minute, because this has very important impacts. So when you look at all of these other licenses, they're filing for a license to export to a non-FTA country. Now, DOE is required to, in effect, shine what we call a national interest criterion lens on these applications. In other words, is it in the U.S.'s best interest to approve these export licenses? Okay. And so they've commissioned some studies to be done. There's a lot of issues with a lot of this stuff that's been done, but the studies have all come back and said, yeah, there's gains from trade. Okay. Important thing about gains from trade is gains from trade are net, right? So there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers, but typically when we say there are net gains from trade, the winners gain more than the losers lose. Okay. That doesn't mean special interests won't line up and make this a political game, right? So there are certain special interests that are major gas consumers in the United States, for example, that see there's a potential for them to lose a little bit here, and so they're fighting this. Really important example of all this would be Dow Chemical, right? They're a company that's really against allowing LNG exports. Right? Well, the big issue here is what will the price impact domestically be if we allow exports? Really what you're talking about when you export gas from the United States is an increase in demand, right? There's more demand for US produced natural gas. And so effectively what you have is two different cases which you can think about. And I wouldn't be a good economist if I didn't show you a couple of supply demand diagrams, right? But this is price quantity, okay? In this case, we have a case where supply is what we call elastic. So it's very responsive to price. So if price increases a little bit, I can get a lot more supply from the line. Okay? Over here, supply is relatively inelastic, so it's not that responsive to price. In other words, I need to have price rise a lot to trigger the same sort of increase in supply. Well, if I use the same sort of starting demand and increase demand by the same amount when you have exports, effectively what you see is in the case where supply is elastic, you get a small increase in price. In the case where supply is relatively inelastic, you get a big increase in price. And so in a nutshell, all the studies that have been done, what they've done is they've said, first of all, they've not approached it from the appropriate international trade framework, which I'm going to get to in just a second, but what they've said is they said, let's just assume you have X amount of exports from the United States, 6 billion cubic feet a day, 12 billion cubic feet a day. One recent study let it go all the way up to 32 billion cubic feet a day, which is complete nonsense, by the way, because the total liquefied natural gas market globally is 32 BCF a day. Okay? So even adding 6 is a bit of a leap, to be honest with you. But they just said, let's just shift the demand curve out by this much and see what the price impact is. If that's all you're doing, then the differences between the studies boils down to what the assumption is about the elasticity of supply. It's that simple, right? It's not that complicated. So then you have to ask yourself, well, what's the elasticity of supply in the United States? And we've done a ton of work at the Baker Institute modeling global gas markets. And we actually did some work for the DOE about 2 years ago now. It's published about 2 years ago now. Looking at the impact of shale on not only the domestic market, but the global market, and more broadly, energy and national security interests. Well, 2 scenarios. You can imagine a scenario that's more like the 2001 case that I showed in the satellite picture earlier, right, where there's no shale. And you can simulate that world, you get lower demand, you have higher prices, you're importing a lot of LNG in the United States, and that's the light blue bars. So these are the annual average prices by decade going out through 2040. Okay. Then you say, all right, let's bring all the shale into the picture. What do we know about the world today? And see what the difference is. Well, you don't import anything, right? You end up producing a lot more and consuming a lot more because price is lower, right? So you get a demand response. But you see the decadal annual average prices are considerably different. Right? Well, you can use the delta between the cases to in effect calculate what the elasticity of supply is. Okay? And so what we actually found is that when you add with shale in the mix, it's roughly 1.5. So what this means is that for every 1% change in price, we get a 1.5% change in supply, okay, or increase in supply. In other words, it's a relatively flat curve. Okay. Without shale, it's relatively inelastic. Right? So the curve's a lot steeper. And so you say, all right, well, if we take that on board, now we can then say, maybe we ought to think about this in a real international trade context. Right? Don't think about this problem as if we're just going to export a certain amount and see what happens. Because the international market will respond, right? If I start adding supply somewhere, don't you think price in that region should react? It's precisely what happens, yeah.
Is there any resale after that?
In some cases there can be, yeah. It depends on the nature of the delivery contract. But even there, if you add more supply to the region, you're increasing fungibility, so you can, by displacement, effectively do the same thing. Yeah. That happens all the time in the North American market, which is very liquid. So, simple international trade framework. Domestic market, foreign market. Right? What you have here is a supply curve and a demand curve. Demand shifts out because we start to export. Right? X, however, is not what we call exogenous. It's not just given on high. It's not like God comes down and says it will be this. Okay? It's actually determined by the model itself, right? Or by the economies themselves. Over here, what I'm doing is I'm adding supply, so imports. M has to equal X, right? So imports have to equal exports. I add supply over here, and price will drop. What has to happen in a long-run equilibrium is the prices in both markets will adjust so that you cover the transportation costs, or the cost of the trade. That's basically what comes out of it. So notice what that means is if I said X is something much bigger than this, that eventuality is never going to occur. Because basically what it means is that you're violating the simple economics of trade. So that's a critical problem with a lot of the studies that have been done that have just shined the sort of US-centric view on this whole thing. You have to evaluate these questions in international trade framework. So there's a lot of different things we can look at, and it's not just, you know, that idea, the notion that exports and imports are endogenous, right? And this is important because if you treat them as if they're not, then you're really not shining the right national interest criterion on this whole thing, right? And then you're really not getting a true assessment of what shale means for energy security and national security, and what sort of commercial opportunities might arise. So we can think about all this, and we can look at prices around the world, and then start to evaluate, well, what's the opportunity really look like for trade, right? Is this something we even really need to be that worried about? What you see here, this gray line is what we call an oil index price. Again, it's just the price of Brent crude oil multiplied by 0.14. Okay? It's indicative of what an oil index price or a contract price would be. Contracted volumes are what we call inframarginal. In other words, they're not the trade at the margin. They represent right now about 80% of total trade. Okay? A decade ago, they represented about 95% of total trade. So the spot market has grown. And this owes itself to the stuff we've already talked about, the fact that there's much more liquidity in the market, more fungibility. Okay? These other prices are spot prices. So these are the prices at the margin. These are the ones where, you know, price discovery is occurring. These aren't contracted prices, these are prices at the margin. The green line is what we call a JKM, that's the Japan-Korea marker price. It's a spot price for LNG delivered into Asia. The red line is what we call NBP, that's the national balancing point. It's the spot price in the UK. Okay, and that is a very liquid market. It's very similar to the United States in terms of trading activities, so on and so forth. The blue line is Henry Hub. That's US, right? It's where the NYMEX contract is indexed. So what you can see here is up until about, and these are daily prices, right? But up until about the middle of 2010, all of these were moving together. Then about the middle of 2010, something started to happen with the Henry Hub price. It started to drift south of all these things. Why does that happen? Well, it happens because we can't export gas from the United States right now, right? You've got a lot of supply coming online, so everything's bottlenecked. So what that means, you've got this bottleneck and supplies building, it's going to put downward pressure on price. This is where the arbitrage opportunity starts to appear, right? Why might we want to export gas? Well, because I'd love to be able to sell from here to here, right? We'll make more money doing that. The red and the green continue to move together. These are both LNG destination markets. Both markets import LNG. The UK imports LNG, Japan and Korea import LNG. So they move together because there's a common point of arbitrage between the two countries, and that's Qatar, in the Middle East. Qatar is the largest LNG exporter in the world. They export LNG to both countries. Both sets of countries, both Europe and Asia. Well, a very distinct event occurred on March 11th, 2011. This was the day of the disaster at Fukushima. The big earthquake where the nuke went down and created a massive ripple effect in Japan. Okay? Now, the spot price of LNG within a week of that occurring jumped by $2 an MCF. That's a big move. Okay? Why might that happen? Well, because ultimately what happens, you end up shutting down nukes, right? In particular, there were two that were shut down right in the immediate wake of this, right? One for safety reasons, the other because it was destroyed, right? Well, you shut those down, but you still need electricity. So what do you have to do? Well, you have to start importing more natural gas. So demand for natural gas in Japan jumps. Well, then the safety issue starts to gain some sort of public momentum, right? And then what happens for the rest of the year is you see the phase shutdown of every single nuclear reactor in Japan. It's a lot of capacity. Okay? Take it all offline. Well, that means liquefied natural gas demand explodes in Japan, right? Literally just skyrockets. And so what you see is lockstep with those phase shutdowns is a rise in